She laughed when the device sat on my kitchen island, hidden under a towel like an embarrassment. She thought the cruelest thing in the room was her joke. She had no idea what would happen after the market agreed I was right. By the time my family came pounding on my door, screaming for me after the buyout hit, the only thing louder than their panic was the silence I saved for them. My name is Annabelle Fairfax. I am 34 years old, and for the last 2 years, I have lived 2 completely different lives. By day, I was a respectable, quietly competent product designer for a mid-sized firm in Charlotte. By night, I was something much more obsessive. I invited them all over on a Saturday evening. My parents, my older sister Meredith Barrett, and a few close relatives filled my rented townhouse with the sounds of clinking wine glasses and loud, overlapping conversations. I had spent the entire afternoon cooking a roast, cleaning the baseboards, and making sure the place looked like the home of a perfectly well-adjusted adult. But the only thing that mattered to me was sitting on the kitchen island, draped under a checkered dish towel. I had waited almost 24 months for this exact night. 24 months of burnt fingertips from soldering irons, hundreds of hours reading through electrical safety codes until my vision blurred, and thousands of dollars quietly drained from my savings account to fund prototype iterations. I was finally ready to show them. I thought they would be proud. I thought they would see me. When dinner was cleared, I stood up and walked over to the island. The room went quiet, a polite, expectant hush settling over my family. I pulled the towel away. Underneath sat Pan Sentinel. It did not look like a homemade science fair project. It looked like a finished, consumer-ready device. It was a compact stove safety retrofit, designed specifically for apartments and small homes where space is tight and landlords are notoriously cheap. I explained to the silent room how it worked. I told them how the array of sensors could detect dangerous heat patterns, map unattended burner behavior, and identify the highly specific particulate signatures of grease smoke. If a pan was left unattended and reached a critical flashpoint, the device did not just beep uselessly. It communicated with a linked shutoff relay installed behind the stove, immediately cutting the power before a kitchen fire could even escalate. I explained it with a tremor in my voice, because this was not just a clever engineering puzzle to me. It came from a very real, very ugly wound. 5 years ago, I lived in an older apartment complex on the edge of the city. One night, a neighbor fell asleep while frying food. The fire that tore through our neighboring unit nearly destroyed the entire building. I still have nightmares about the heat that radiated through the drywall, the choking black smoke that filled the hallways, and the sheer terror of realizing how quickly just a little smoke turns into a catastrophe that leaves families standing on the sidewalk with absolutely nothing. I built Pan Sentinel so that would never happen to anyone else. I built it to buy people the 3 minutes that separate a ruined dinner from a ruined life. I finished my explanation and looked at my family, my heart hammering against my ribs. I waited for my father to nod in that slow, impressed way of his. I waited for my mother to ask how she could get one for her own kitchen. Instead, Meredith spoke first. Meredith is a director of regional partnerships for Northridge Home, a massive household name appliance company. She has always possessed a corporate polish that made my quiet design work feel small and provincial. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table, her eyes scanning the device with a look of amused pity. "So," Meredith said, her voice dripping with casual authority, "it is a burnt toast babysitter for adults who cannot cook." There was a beat of silence, and then my father chuckled. It started as a low rumble in his chest, but then my mother joined in, her hand covering her mouth as her shoulders shook. Soon, Uncle David and Aunt Susan were laughing too. They were not laughing nervously to break the tension. It was genuine, unbridled delight. They looked at each other, sharing the joke, feeding off Meredith's sharp tongue. In the span of 10 seconds, my private sacrifice, my late nights, my trauma, and my entirely viable engineering achievement were transformed into evening entertainment. I stood perfectly still by the kitchen island. My hands, which had been resting proudly beside the prototype, slowly dropped to my sides. Meredith sensed the room was hers and pushed further, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Annie, think about it," she said, using the childhood nickname that always made me feel like I was 12 years old. "Nobody is ever going to buy a panic puck. You are asking people to install a permanent reminder in their kitchen that says they are too incompetent to boil water without burning their house down. It is terrible marketing." More laughter rippled through the room. My mother wiped a tear from her eye. "Oh, Meredith, stop it. You are being mean," she said. But she was smiling widely, clearly enjoying the performance. "I am not being mean. I am giving her free industry advice," Meredith countered, holding her hands up in mock defense. She looked directly at me, her eyes hard and bright with the thrill of dominance. "It is a neat little gadget, Annie, it really is. But maybe you should just stick to your cute little side project life. Let the big companies handle the real appliances." I opened my mouth, perhaps to defend the underlying technology, perhaps to remind them of the fire that nearly killed me. But as my eyes tracked across the table, the words died in my throat. Meredith's phone was propped up against the base of her wine glass. The screen was angled slightly away from me, but I could see the reflection in the dark window pane behind her. The camera was open. The red recording indicator was blinking steadily. She was secretly filming the table. She was filming my earnest presentation, her own devastating punchline, and the chorus of family laughter that followed. She was gathering content. I knew exactly what she was going to do with it. She was going to share it in a private chat with her Northridge colleagues to prove how sharp and witty she was. Using her little sister's delusion as the punchline. That tiny blinking red dot hit me harder than any of the words she had spoken. It was a violation so profound, so casually cruel, that it bypassed my anger entirely and struck something much deeper. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my hand on the counter or demand that she delete the video. I did not try to argue the merits of the shut-off relay or the statistical frequency of grease fires in rental units. I simply stood there, looking at the people who shared my blood. As the laughter slowly died down and the conversation shifted back to Uncle David's upcoming vacation, I felt a clean, irreversible shift inside my chest. It felt like a heavy iron door swinging shut and locking with a definitive, echoing click. In that quiet, humiliating moment, I saw the absolute truth of my existence within this family. They loved me, yes, but only as a concept. They loved the Annabelle who was quiet, the Annabelle who was struggling just enough to need their advice, the Annabelle who served roast chicken and stayed safely in the background. They only liked me when I was entirely non-threatening. The moment I stepped out of my assigned role, the moment I presented something that challenged Meredith's status as the sole business success in the family, I ceased to be a sister or a daughter. I became a target. I became a joke to be captured on a smartphone and distributed for social currency. I looked down at Pan Sentinel. It was no longer just an invention. It was the line drawn in the sand. I quietly picked up the checkered dish towel and draped it back over the device, hiding it from their view. Let them think I was retreating. Let them think the joke had landed and I was sufficiently put back in my place. The dinner continued for another 2 hours. I poured more wine. I served the dessert. I smiled at the right times and cleared the plates with steady hands. But the Annabelle who had excitedly invited them over was gone, burned away as cleanly as dry paper in a flash fire. The woman cleaning the kitchen was someone else entirely. The last car door slammed shut outside, the engine noise fading down the street. I stood at the kitchen sink, plunging my hands into the soapy water, scrubbing the roasting pan until my knuckles ached. The house was entirely silent, but the echoes of their laughter were deafening. I replayed every single sentence in my head. A burnt toast babysitter, a cute little side project. Nobody would ever buy a panic puck. I let the words wash over me, feeling the initial wave of humiliation try to take root in my stomach, trying to convince me to throw the prototype in the trash. Humiliation is a funny thing. It can rot you from the inside out, turning you into someone who constantly apologizes for existing, someone who shrinks to fit the small space their family leaves for them. Or, if you trap it, if you compress it under enough pressure, it hardens into something entirely different. It hardens into fuel. I did not sleep that night. I did not even try. I brewed a pot of dark coffee and went to work. By the time the sun came up, painting the living room walls in a pale gray light, my rented townhouse no longer looked like a home. It had become a war room. I had dragged everything out of the spare bedroom closet. Open circuit boards cluttered the breakfast table, their green surfaces gleaming next to half-empty coffee mugs. I had used masking tape to stick thermal logs against the oak kitchen cabinets, turning the wood into a sprawling canvas of heat spike graphs and cooling curve data. Scattered across the hardwood floor were dozens of pages of legal notes regarding tenant liability codes, local fire ordinances, and property management regulations. Lined up along the windowsill, like a row of silent evidence, were 6 failed sensor housings from the first year of development. They were scorched, melted, or cracked from my early dangerous testing phases. I stared at them, breathing in the scent of cold coffee and ozone, realizing that my family had looked at my survival mechanism and seen a toy. I realized I could not do this in a vacuum anymore. I could not rely on my own protective instincts to refine the product. I needed someone who would look at the device and tell me exactly what was wrong with it. Someone who would test the idea honestly without trying to break my spirit in the process. At 9 a.m, I picked up my phone and called Miles Danner. Miles was a former fire loss analyst who had transitioned into working as a hardware reliability consultant for commercial insurance firms. We had crossed paths briefly at an industrial design seminar a year ago. I remembered his blunt, unsentimental approach to product failure. He was the kind of man who looked at a burned-down building and saw a math equation, a failure of materials and policy, rather than a tragedy. He arrived 2 hours later, wearing a faded gray jacket, holding a dented travel mug. He did not offer any comforting words or polite small talk about the weather. He walked straight to the kitchen island, picked up the prototype, and began tearing into the concept with brutal surgical precision. "What happens when I sear a steak at 400 degrees?" Miles asked, his voice flat, turning the device over in his large hands. "Does your little box kill the power and ruin my dinner?" "It distinguishes between ambient cooking heat and rapid, uncontrolled particulate escalation," I replied, crossing my arms. "It uses an optical sensor paired with a thermal array." He did not blink. "False positives are a death sentence in consumer hardware. If this thing goes off because someone boils pasta water too aggressively and steam hits the lens, they will rip it off the wall and throw it in the trash. And what is the retrofit cost? If it takes an electrician 3 hours to hardwire this shut-off relay behind the stove, no property manager on earth is going to install it across a 300-unit complex. It is too expensive. The labor alone will kill the purchase order." He dropped the prototype back onto the island with a heavy thud and paced across the room, stepping carefully over my scattered legal notes. "Furthermore, what is the liability exposure? If your device fails to shut off the stove due to a power surge, and a fire happens anyway, does the landlord sue you? Do they sue the manufacturer? You are stepping into a legal minefield. Why would a building owner take on that risk when they can just force tenants to buy renter's insurance and wash their hands of the whole thing?" Under normal circumstances, this kind of rapid-fire interrogation would have made me shrink back. I would have stammered, apologized for the flaws, and promised to do better, but I was not shrinking, not today. Every question Miles threw at me felt like a sharpening stone against a blade. I came alive under the pressure. "Because renter's insurance does not stop a fire from spreading through the ventilation shafts to the next 5 apartments," I fired back, stepping directly into his path, forcing him to stop pacing. "Renter's insurance pays out after the building is already ashes. While the landlord waits for the insurance check, they are losing rental income across multiple units for at least 18 months of reconstruction. They face massive hikes in their commercial premium for the next decade. And the property management firm gets a permanent black mark on their regional loss run reports, making it harder for them to secure financing for future properties." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a hard whisper. I know this use case better than anyone sitting in a corporate boardroom because I lived inside the problem. I watched an entire wing of my old complex get condemned over a $2 pan of cooking oil left unattended for 5 minutes. I know the math. Miles. It is cheaper for them to buy my hardware than it is to rebuild a kitchen. Miles stopped. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since he walked through my front door. The skepticism in his eyes shifted, replaced by a glint of genuine professional respect. He took a sip from his travel mug and nodded slowly. "All right," Miles said quietly. "You understand the pain point. Your market logic is sound, but your execution is a mess. You are trying to make this thing do 12 clever things to impress people." He pointed to a schematic taped to the refrigerator. "You have a Bluetooth module here. You have an ambient humidity tracker. You have a companion app interface mapped out. Stop it." He leaned over the table, tapping the core sensor array with his index finger. "If you want my help, we strip this down to the studs. You build one thing that works flawlessly under extreme stress. It does not need to talk to a smartphone. It does not need to track humidity. It needs to do exactly 3 things. Detect real kitchen fire escalation early, act fast to kill the power, and stay simple enough for a basic maintenance worker with a standard screwdriver to install in 15 minutes. No electricians required. That is the only way property managers adopt this at scale." I stared at the blueprints, feeling a momentary pang of resistance. I had spent months coding that Bluetooth module, but then I remembered Meredith's mocking face. I remembered the laughter. I nodded. We spent the next 8 hours doing exactly that. We gutted the prototype. We ripped out the expensive wireless transmitters and the complicated predictive algorithms. We simplified the shutoff relay, replacing a complex motorized breaker with a heavy-duty, industrial magnetic contactor that cost a fraction of the price and had a failure rate of basically 0. We altered the housing, removing the sleek, consumer-friendly curves and replacing them with a rugged, heat-resistant polymer shell designed to withstand impact and grease buildup. We turned my precious, over-engineered invention into a blunt, reliable, foolproof instrument. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across my living room floor, the device on the table looked completely different. It looked raw. It looked industrial. It was no longer pretty. I sat back in my chair, staring at the redesigned schematics spread across the table. My hands were covered in ink and graphite dust. My back ached from hunching over the work surface. Yet, for the first time since the family dinner the night before, I felt something far steadier than anger. Anger is chaotic. Anger makes you sloppy, makes you want to shout and prove people wrong with volume. What I felt now was cold, clear, and intensely focused. I felt dangerous. The idea was no longer a sentimental project born out of my own trauma. It was no longer a vulnerable piece of my soul offered up for my family's approval and amusement. Under Miles's ruthless guidance, it was becoming commercially sharp. The fat had been trimmed. We had forged a tool designed to solve a multi-million-dollar problem for an industry that bled cash every time a tenant forgot to turn off a stove. The humiliation of the previous night had completely burned away, leaving only a disciplined momentum. I was ready to go to war. Miles made good on his promise exactly 11 days later. He used an old industry connection to secure a 20-minute meeting with the regional operations director for Brick Harbor Residential. Brick Harbor was a massive, sprawling property management firm that specialized in older, high-density apartment complexes. It was the kind of housing that possessed aging electrical systems and a terrifyingly high rate of tenant-caused fire incidents. They were currently drowning in tenant fire claims and bleeding millions of dollars in insurance premium hikes. The operations director, a perpetually exhausted man named Marcus Vance, sat behind a desk buried in risk assessment files. He listened to my pitch with the blank, heavily lidded expression of someone who expected to be disappointed. He did not care about my design philosophy or my personal connection to the problem. He cared exclusively about his overhead. He agreed to a tiny, unpaid pilot program in exactly one building, a rundown brick low-rise on the east side of the city. For one simple reason, it cost his company absolutely $0. I had to agree to install, monitor, and troubleshoot every single unit myself, assuming all liability for the hardware during the test phase. I signed the paperwork without hesitating. The transition from theoretical engineering to practical application was brutal. Every morning, I clocked in at my day job at Cedar and Loom Fixtures, a high-end interior hardware company, from 9 in the morning until 5 in the evening. I sat in a pristine, climate-controlled studio, designing brushed brass drawer pulls and minimalist bathroom sconces. It was sterile, polite, and entirely divorced from real-world consequence. Then, at 6 o'clock in the evening, I changed into a pair of heavy denim coveralls, loaded my trunk with toolboxes, and drove across the city to the Brick Harbor pilot building. The early field tests were incredibly ugly. A laboratory environment is controlled, but a lived-in apartment kitchen is pure chaos. On the third day of the pilot, a tenant in Unit 2 boiled a massive pot of water for pasta. The rolling heavy steam hit the optical sensor, confusing the thermal algorithm, and triggered a deafening, piercing alert at 8 o'clock at night. The tenant threatened to rip the device off the wall with a hammer. 2 days later, a resident who seemingly fried food for every single meal managed to coat the sensor array in Unit 4 with a thick film of aerosolized grease, effectively blinding the device. I had to rip the casing apart and redesign the protective shell to include a downward-facing sloped hood that shielded the optics. The hardest challenge came at the end of the first week. The pilot building was old, and Unit 9 still ran on an outdated breaker panel from 1978. My modern shutoff sequence sent a voltage spike that the antique panel interpreted as a hard short, tripping the main breaker for the entire apartment every time the device cycled its diagnostic check. I spent 5 hours lying on my back on a sticky linoleum floor, wedged in the dark space between a greasy oven and a baseboard cabinet, rewriting the firmware line by line on a dusty laptop to create a staggered, low-voltage shutoff command. I drove home at 3 in the morning smelling of old cooking oil and metallic dust. My hands cramped, my eyes burning with exhaustion, but I kept gathering evidence. I logged every false positive. I adjusted the code. I trained the system to definitively distinguish between the nuisance heat of a boiling kettle and the aggressive exponential temperature curve of an unattended grease fire. The breakthrough happened on a Tuesday evening, 22 days into the pilot. I was sitting at my kitchen island, eating a cold sandwich, when my phone vibrated violently against the countertop. The custom dashboard I had built flashed bright red. Unit 14 had triggered a critical escalation alert. I pulled up the live telemetry data. The burner temperature had spiked from ambient to over 400 degrees in less than 3 minutes. The optical sensor confirmed heavy, continuous smoke particulate. Exactly 4 seconds after hitting the danger threshold, Pan Sentinel bypassed the warning beep and instantly severed the power to the stove through the magnetic contactor. I drove to the complex in record time, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. When I arrived at Unit 14, I found the tenant, a young college student, standing in her kitchen with the front door propped open, waving a dish towel at the ceiling. The apartment smelled sharply of burnt canola oil. She had put a pan of oil on the stove to heat up for French fries, stepped out onto the balcony to take a phone call, and completely forgot about the burner. "I do not know what happened," she told me, coughing slightly as I inspected the appliance. "The stove just died. It is completely broken." I looked at the smoking, blackened pan sitting on the dead coil. If the burner had stayed on for another 90 seconds, the oil would have reached its auto-ignition temperature. The flames would have caught the cheap laminate cabinets directly above the stove, and within 5 minutes, the entire kitchen would have been an inferno. She did not realize I had just saved her life. She was just annoyed her dinner was delayed. I smiled, a tight, exhausted smile, and reset the breaker. "It is a safety feature," I told her. "Just be careful next time." I sent the data log to Marcus Vance the next morning. I expected a warm, congratulatory phone call. I expected a moment of shared triumph. Instead, Marcus called me into his office, bypassed any form of greeting, and slapped a printed copy of my data log onto his desk. He did not celebrate. He looked at me with a terrifyingly serious expression and started asking entirely different questions. If I wanted to roll this out to our entire regional portfolio, roughly 6,000 units, what is your bulk manufacturing cost? He demanded, tapping a pen rhythmically against the desk. How fast can you train my maintenance teams to install the shutoff relay? Can we get the installation time down to 10 minutes per unit? Because if we can prove this works across 1,000 kitchens, I can take this data to our insurance underwriters and demand a 20% reduction in our annual property premiums. He was not looking at me like an amateur inventor anymore. He was looking at me like a massive, scalable asset. The idea had officially moved from a curious pilot program to a hard commercial opportunity. 3 days later, Miles called me with even heavier news. A senior risk actuary from Ashmere Mutual, one of the largest commercial property insurers in the country, had quietly reached out to him. Someone at Brick Harbor had leaked the early success of the pilot. Ashmere Mutual was requesting a formal presentation of the performance data. They were not interested in the hardware itself. They were interested in the math. A product that reliably reduced catastrophic kitchen fire claims could save their underwriting division tens of millions of dollars a year in payouts. I sat on the edge of my bed after hanging up with Miles, staring at the blank wall of my bedroom. My heart was beating a heavy, rapid rhythm against my ribs. It was a thrill, but it was a thrill that almost scared me. My family had mocked the device because it lacked social prestige. They could only understand value through the lens of a sleek, consumer-facing brand that made people look wealthy or sophisticated. But the people who actually understood risk, the operators who lived in the margins of liability and catastrophic loss, were responding to my invention with a ferocious, predatory intensity. They did not care if the device was a dull gray box hidden behind a stove. They cared that it stopped fires. They cared that it protected their bottom line. I had spent my entire life trying to impress people who only valued status. Now, I was sitting on a technology that was suddenly drawing the attention of people who controlled millions of dollars. And they were paying attention not because I was charming, but because I had built something undeniably real. Exactly 7 days after the Ashmere Mutual request, an email landed in my primary inbox. It was sent at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. The sender address belonged to the Corporate Development Division of Northridge Home. The subject line read, "Inquiry regarding consumer stove event mitigation." My blood ran cold. The skin on the back of my neck prickled. Consumer stove event mitigation. That was not standard industry phrasing. It was a highly specific, sanitized, corporate translation of exactly what my hardware did. I forwarded the email to Miles. He called me exactly 4 minutes later. He had spent the morning working his own network, reaching out to old hardware consulting contacts who brushed up against the appliance giant. What he found out made my stomach turn over. Meredith had not just kept that video on her phone to laugh at privately. On the Monday morning following our family dinner, she had uploaded the clip to a private, interdepartmental messaging channel at Northridge. She had captioned it with something mocking about my ridiculous little fire gadget, fully expecting her colleagues to pile on and laugh at my expense. But Northridge is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. They do not employ engineers and risk assessors to simply laugh at viable safety solutions. Someone in that chat channel did not laugh. Someone recognized the raw, unpolished commercial potential sitting on my kitchen island. They downloaded the video, stripped Meredith's mocking commentary from the context, and passed the concept upward to the innovation scouting team. My sister's cruelty had accidentally functioned as a free corporate scouting expedition. I dialed Meredith's number. She answered on the third ring, her tone breezy and distracted, likely typing an email while she spoke to me. I asked her directly about the video. I asked her exactly who she sent it to. She let out a long, exasperated sigh. She told me I was overreacting. She admitted she shared a tiny clip with a few work friends because she thought the name Burnt Toast Babysitter was hilarious. When I told her about the corporate development email, she literally scoffed. She insisted nobody at her level or above would ever take my little arts and crafts project seriously enough for it to matter. She told me to stop being so paranoid, told me I was acting crazy, and hung up. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the dark screen. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone across the room. The cold, clear focus that had taken root in my chest the morning after the dinner suddenly crystallized into something entirely rigid. I immediately called my patent attorney. We had filed a basic provisional patent 1 year ago, just enough to establish a filing date. I told him to convert it immediately. We needed to execute a far more aggressive, comprehensive protection strategy. I spent the next 48 hours doing nothing but documentation. I gathered every single graphite sketch, every time-stamped firmware revision, every installation log from the Brick Harbor pilot, and every rejected sensor housing. I built an impenetrable fortress of prior art, proving my ownership of the concept long before Northridge ever typed the words stove event mitigation. Miles came over on Thursday evening. He looked around my living room, noting the neatly stacked binders of evidence. He told me it was time to go entirely dark. He said we needed to stop talking like hopeful, scrappy inventors and start behaving like people who were actively being hunted. We spent the night tightening our digital access. We moved all development files to an encrypted offline drive. We watermarked every single internal schematic with invisible digital signatures. But paranoia is only useful if you know exactly where the threat is coming from. I needed to know just how deep the leak inside Northridge went, and more importantly, I needed to know if they were still monitoring me through my family. I decided to set a trap. On Sunday afternoon, my mother initiated a group video call with the family. It was a standard, chaotic catch-up, full of overlapping voices. Meredith was on the screen, looking bored, sipping from a mug. About 20 minutes into the call, my mother asked, in that patronizing, gentle tone she reserved for my failures, how my little project was going. I smiled. I made my voice sound bright, naive, and completely unguarded. I told them I was incredibly excited because I was currently coding a brand new feature. I claimed I was integrating a voice assistant override. I explained, in completely fabricated detail, how a user could simply yell at the device to cancel a false alarm from across the room using standard smart home speakers. It was a total lie. I had never built that feature. After my grueling redesign with Miles, I had explicitly removed all complex integrations to ensure foolproof reliability. I had absolutely zero intention of ever adding voice commands to a critical safety shutoff relay. It was an idiotic engineering choice, but it sounded flashy. It sounded exactly like the kind of bloated, over-engineered feature a massive appliance company would love to market. I watched Meredith square on the video call. Her eyes flicked slightly off camera, her hand subtly reaching for her mouse. She was taking notes. Exactly 14 days later, Miles walked into my kitchen and dropped a printed document onto the counter. He had called in a major favor from a former colleague who now worked in compliance at Northridge. It was an internal innovation strategy memo, circulated among their upper management just 48 hours prior. I read the second page. Under a section titled Next Generation Kitchen Safety Horizons, there was a bulleted list of proposed functionalities for a theoretical retrofit device. The third bullet point suggested exploring voice-activated override protocols via smart home ecosystem integration. I stared at the black ink on the white paper. The trap had snapped shut with bone-breaking precision. It was the final piece of proof I needed. My family's ridicule had not stopped at personal cruelty. Meredith had not just humiliated me for sport. She had actively, continuously monitored my progress under the guise of familial small talk, and she was funneling my supposed updates directly to her superiors to buy herself corporate favor. The betrayal was complete, creeping into my life disguised as sisterly teasing, only to manifest as calculated professional theft. I folded the memo and slid it into my primary evidence binder. I was no longer just building a company, I was preparing a slaughter. My patent attorney's office was located on the 42nd floor of a glass tower downtown. a stark contrast to my cluttered living room. We sat across from each other at a massive oak table, the surface completely covered with the physical manifestation of my defense strategy. We spent 3 hours meticulously packaging the evidence trail. It was a beautiful, lethal collection of documents. First was the raw data. We compiled every time-stamped computer-aided design file spanning back 24 months, cross-referenced with the physical receipts for every resistor and polymer casing I had ever purchased. Next came the operational proof, the encrypted pilot logs from the East Side low-rise, verifying our flawless success rate and proving functional viability long before the corporate behemoth even knew my project existed. Then we added the poison pills. We included a certified transcript of the innovation memo my insider had acquired, highlighting the exact paragraph detailing the fabricated voice command feature I had planted during the Sunday video call. Right next to it sat the digital footprint of the stolen dinner video, tracing the IP address of the initial upload directly to my sister's corporate device. We had effectively built a titanium wall around my intellectual property, mortared with the indisputable proof of corporate espionage. We did not have to wait long for the first strike. 4 days later, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived via certified courier. It was from the external litigation firm representing Northridge Home. It was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, a soft intimidation letter designed to terrify a small, underfunded founder into immediate retreat. Across 4 pages of dense legalese, they vaguely referenced their ongoing exploration of consumer-facing heat mitigation ecosystems, hinting heavily that any future commercial launch of my hardware might inadvertently overlap with their proprietary research. They generously offered a brief window for an amicable discussion, a polite way of inviting me to surrender my life's work for pennies before they buried me in endless, bankrupting court proceedings. A year ago, a letter like that would have sent me into a spiral of panic. I would have believed their bluff, but the woman who had cowered in her own kitchen was gone. I sat on my sofa, reading the threats over a cup of black coffee, feeling nothing but a profound, chilling sense of calm. I told my attorney to let them keep talking. We waited a full 72 hours before sending our response. When we finally replied, we did not send a desperate plea or a defensive rant. My counsel delivered a surgical, emotionally detached counterstrike. We politely declined their invitation for an amicable discussion. Instead, we attached an index summary of our preserved evidence. We explicitly listed the timestamp of their innovation memo, juxtaposed with the date of my provisional patent filing. We casually mentioned our awareness of an internal communication channel leak originating from one of their regional directors. We did not make overt threats. We simply turned the lights on, showing their legal department exactly how much ammunition we had stockpiled. It was a devastating maneuver. We let them know, in perfectly polite corporate terminology, that if they attempted to bully us, we would not just defend ourselves. We would publicly expose a multi-billion-dollar appliance manufacturer for stealing safety technology from a female founder via a family betrayal. Miles came over the night we sent the response. He paced the length of my living room, running a hand through his thinning hair, his usual blunt demeanor replaced by a rare, cautious energy. "You are playing a very dangerous game," Miles warned, stopping by the window to look out at the dark street. "You have them backed into a corner right now, but you cannot let the revenge override the business. The goal is to get this hardware into apartment buildings, not to burn your sister's career to the ground just to make a point. Do not lose sight of the commercial objective because you want blood." I looked at him, shaking my head slowly. "You think those two things are different. Miles, they are not. Protecting the integrity of this invention and humiliating the people who dismissed it are now moving in the exact same direction. If I let them steal this, if I let them water it down into some bloated smart home gadget, it will fail. And when it fails, buildings will burn. The only way to protect the product is to utterly break their claim to it." Miles studied my face for a long moment, then slowly nodded, recognizing the absolute finality in my voice. The momentum shifted violently in our favor the following week. Brick Harbor Residential, having caught wind of the brewing legal storm through industry whispers, did not back away. In the cutthroat world of property management, they respected leverage. Marcus Vance called me directly. He was deeply impressed by my composure under pressure and the ironclad defense I had built. He decided that he preferred founders who did not fold the second a larger predator entered the water. He bypassed standard approval protocols and immediately expanded our pilot program. We were jumping from one rundown building to 2 additional properties, adding another 300 units to our operational data pool. It was a massive leap, pushing my manufacturing capacity to its absolute limit, but it cemented our legitimacy in the market. Simultaneously, the quiet conversations with Ashmere Mutual escalated into formal boardroom meetings. Their senior risk actuary reviewed the new expansion parameters and began drafting the framework for a preferred partner arrangement. If our claims reduction performance held steady across the new, wider sample size over the next 90 days, they were prepared to offer aggressive premium discounts to any property owner who installed the hardware. We were no longer just selling a safety monitor, we were selling an insurance loophole. And then, the fortress walls at Northridge began to crack. My phone buzzed on a Thursday evening. The caller ID flashed my sister's name. I let it ring 5 times before answering, letting the silence stretch, forcing her to wait. "Hello?" I said, my voice completely flat. "Hey," she replied, her tone a jarring, chaotic mix of forced casualness and high-pitched anxiety. It was a staggering departure from her usual polished arrogance. "Listen, I think things are getting a little out of hand. Do you not think? With the lawyers and everything?" I did not offer a response. I let the dead air hang between us, thick and heavy. "Look," she pushed on, her breathing slightly uneven. "I know you are upset about the video, and maybe I should not have shared it, but you are being a little too sensitive about this whole thing. It was just a joke. You know how I am. We do not need to make this a whole legal family drama. It is embarrassing for Mom and Dad. Let us just talk to my bosses and work something out quietly." Her words were a masterclass in manipulation, attempting to reframe her corporate theft as a simple sibling misunderstanding. But I heard exactly what she was actually saying: the abrupt switch in tone, the sudden desire to avoid a legal battle, the invocation of our parents. It all confirmed one beautiful, undeniable fact. Her legal department had read my attorney's summary. They had traced the leak back to her. She knew exactly how exposed she was. The corporate shield she had hidden behind her entire career was evaporating, leaving her standing entirely alone. She was no longer the successful older sister offering condescending advice. She was a liability, panicking as the ground crumbled beneath her expensive heels. "Are you there?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly under the weight of my continued silence. I pulled the phone away from my ear, tapped the red button to end the call, and opened my messaging app. I typed out a single sentence, checking it twice to ensure the punctuation was flawless. I did not want to leave any room for misinterpretation. I hit send. "You laughed because you thought I had no leverage. That was your mistake." I placed the phone face down on the kitchen counter, poured myself a glass of cold water, and went back to work. The convention center ballroom was stripped of anything resembling glamour. There were no neon signs, no open bars, and no venture capitalists in expensive sneakers looking for the next disruptive app. The Regional Housing Risk Showcase was a profoundly unsexy event, populated entirely by the people who actually kept cities running. Property portfolio operators, commercial insurance actuaries, and smart building procurement officers filled the rows of uncomfortable folding chairs. These were men and women who calculated risk down to the fractional decimal point. They wore gray suits and practical shoes. They did not care about my vision. They only cared about my math. I stood backstage behind a heavy velvet curtain, adjusting the lapel microphone clipped to my blazer. This was not a vanity stage. I knew exactly what was at stake. If I failed here, I went back to begging individual landlords for a chance, fighting for scraps in a localized market. But if the product worked in front of this specific crowd, we would bypass years of incremental growth. We would move directly into mass contracts and acquisition conversations. The people in this room had the authority to mandate hardware across thousands of properties with a single signature. I walked out under the harsh fluorescent stage lights. In the center of the platform sat a scaled-down, functional mock kitchen encased in thick plexiglass. I had wired a standard electric stove to a dedicated power source, integrated with my hardware. I began my presentation, walking the audience through the financial burden of residential fire claims. I spoke about the specific liability loopholes property managers faced. Then, I turned to the plexiglass box to initiate the live demonstration. I placed a cast iron skillet filled with cooking oil onto the front burner and cranked the dial to maximum heat. Behind me, a massive projector screen displayed the live telemetry from my custom software dashboard. The thermal graph began to climb steadily. 100 degrees, 200 degrees. The optical sensor confirmed the baseline environment. The crowd watched the screen, waiting for the system to detect the flashpoint and kill the power. I watched the gauge hit 400 degrees. The alert protocol was supposed to trigger instantly. Instead, the dashboard froze. A tiny gray buffering circle appeared in the center of the projection screen, the network relay, routing the signal from the stage through the convention center's heavily congested wireless grid, had stalled. The skillet began to smoke. The hardware on the stove was functioning perfectly, but the software dashboard my audience was watching was completely dead. The silence in the cavernous ballroom became instantly heavy. I felt a cold bead of sweat slide down between my shoulder blades. In the second row, a senior buyer from a massive real estate trust crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. Someone toward the back coughed politely. I could feel the entire room shifting away from me, their mild curiosity instantly curdling into polite skepticism. They were writing me off as just another hopeful amateur with a buggy prototype. I opened my mouth to explain the network latency, my brain scrambling for a graceful recovery. Before I could speak a single word, the heavy double doors at the far end of the ballroom slammed open. The loud crack echoed off the high ceiling, startling the audience. A man in a high-visibility vest and a hard hat rushed down the center aisle, breathing heavily. It was Greg, the lead facility manager from Brick Harbor's newest pilot property on the west side. He was clutching a ruggedized tablet to his chest. He did not care that I was in the middle of a keynote presentation. He marched straight up to the edge of the stage, his face flushed with adrenaline. "We just had a live event at the West Side Complex," Greg announced, his voice carrying without a microphone. "Unit 312. A tenant put a pan of grease on a rear burner and went down to the lobby to get her mail. She got stuck talking to a neighbor." He held up the tablet, his hands shaking slightly. "Your device killed the breaker 3 minutes ago." It sent the cutoff ping to my maintenance queue before the smoke could even reach the ceiling detector. We avoided a total structural loss by about 60 seconds. The stage demonstration suddenly ceased to matter. The buffering circle on the projector screen was entirely irrelevant. I stepped forward, grabbed the connecting cable from my podium, and plugged it directly into Greg's tablet. The massive screen behind me flickered, replacing my frozen dashboard with raw, unedited security footage from the pilot building's third-floor hallway. The timestamps glowed brightly in the bottom corner of the video feed. The audience watched as a maintenance worker jogged down the corridor, unlocked Unit 312, and pushed the door open to reveal a haze of white smoke. But absolutely no fire. I pulled up the system logs right beside the video feed. The data was indisputable. The hardware had functioned flawlessly under actual, chaotic conditions. I turned back to the audience. My voice was steady, anchored by the absolute truth of what they were seeing. "Laboratory perfection is useful," I told the room, gesturing toward the plexiglass box on the stage. "Controlled environments make for nice slides. But you do not manage controlled environments. You manage housing. You manage exhausted parents, distracted college students, and elderly tenants who forget they left the stove on. What matters in housing risk is not whether a device works on a stage. What matters is whether it acts correctly when real people are careless, tired, or overwhelmed." The atmosphere in the ballroom did not just shift, it completely inverted. The polite skepticism vanished, replaced by a tense, aggressive recalculation. Notebooks flipped open. Men and women who had been leaning back in their chairs were suddenly leaning forward, staring intently at the timestamps on the screen. They were no longer looking at a clever gadget. They were looking at a shield against catastrophic liability. The buyers realized simultaneously that the invention was not merely innovative, it was going to be incredibly expensive not to own it. If one management company adopted this standard of safety, the rest would be legally negligent by comparison. As the room erupted into a low roar of urgent, whispered conversations between partners and actuaries, I let my gaze drift toward the back of the auditorium. I scanned the final row of folding chairs, hidden entirely in the shadows beneath the mezzanine overhang. Meredith was sitting near the exit. She wore a pristine black trench coat, her posture stiff and unnatural. She had clearly slipped in late, intending to sit quietly in the dark. She had come hoping to watch a public failure. She had come to witness the collapse of the project she had mocked, desperate for validation that I was still the naive younger sister who could not compete in the real world. Instead, she was trapped in her chair. She had to sit there in absolute silence while hundreds of elite industry professionals completely repriced my worth in real time. Our eyes met across the vast distance of the ballroom. I did not smile. I did not glare. I simply held her gaze for 3 long seconds, letting her feel the immense, crushing weight of her own miscalculation, before turning my back to her and answering the first question from the hungry crowd. Within 48 hours of stepping off that stage, the entire landscape of my life fundamentally altered. The inbox that used to receive occasional tracking updates for cheap resistors and thermal sensors was suddenly a battleground of corporate maneuvering. I was no longer a desperate founder begging for a single building to test my hardware. I was the architect of a mandatory industry standard, and the market was reacting with terrifying speed. I was fielding aggressive interest from 3 distinct directions. Ashmere Mutual moved first, bypassing their usual bureaucratic delays to send over a 90-page preliminary term sheet. They wanted to formally establish a risk reduction partnership, offering to subsidize the cost of my hardware for any commercial property owner holding a policy over $10 million. The following morning, Varello Living Systems entered the fray. They were a dominant player in residential automation, and they did not just want to buy units. They wanted a massive strategic investment, demanding 30% equity in exchange for a massive capital injection, aiming to lock my shutoff relay exclusively into their proprietary smart home packages. And then came Hearthloop Systems. They were the apex predator of multifamily property technology, a ruthless, cash-heavy juggernaut. They bypassed the introductory emails entirely and dispatched a formal letter of intent to my legal counsel. They wanted to discuss an outright acquisition. They wanted to swallow the technology whole, own the patents, and control the entire vertical market before anyone else could even get a foothold. The environment of these negotiations was entirely alien to me. Unlike the original family mockery, which was loud, performative, and fueled by wine and petty insecurities, these conversations were profoundly silent. They were precise, heavily documented, and driven by a cold, mathematical hunger. There was no shouting, no laughter, and no emotion whatsoever. It was surgical. And because it was so utterly devoid of feeling, it felt infinitely more dangerous than anything I had ever experienced. I was swimming with leviathans, and every single contract clause was designed to either enrich me or consume me entirely. While my professional trajectory was going vertical, Meredith's problems began quietly, like a hairline fracture in a load-bearing wall. It started when Northridge Home officially opened an internal ethics review. Their legal department, having thoroughly digested the titanium wall of evidence my attorney had sent them, realized they were standing on a live landmine. To shield the corporation from a devastating intellectual property lawsuit, they had to isolate the infection. They discovered the exact digital trail showing my sister had circulated the video clip that triggered the entire chain of corporate espionage. Thanks to Miles and his compliance contact inside Northridge, I learned exactly what was happening behind their closed doors. But I learned something much worse than the fact she was being investigated. I received a forwarded transcript of the actual emails she had sent to her superiors when she initially pitched my hardware as an acquisition target. She had not merely mocked the invention internally to get a laugh. She had actively framed me to her executives, in black and white text. She had described me as highly emotional, largely unserious, and entirely lacking the business acumen to defend my own intellectual property. She told her corporate development team that I was unstable and would be exceptionally easy to outmaneuver in a negotiation. She had essentially drawn a map of my supposed psychological weaknesses and handed it to a multi-billion-dollar corporation, inviting them to rob me blind. The betrayal was so absolute, so thoroughly stripped of any sisterly affection, that I did not even feel angry when I read it. I just felt a profound, freezing clarity. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was my father. He had not called me since the dinner party. He usually relied on my mother to handle any emotional heavy lifting, preferring to float above the fray. But he called on a Thursday evening, his voice adopting that forced, booming tone he used when he wanted to assert his authority as the patriarch. He immediately tried to minimize the situation. He told me that my mother was sick with worry, that the family was being torn apart, and that this was all just a case of sisters being dramatic over a misunderstanding. He suggested, with a heavy dose of condescension, that I should be the bigger person and call Northridge to drop whatever ridiculous legal threats my lawyers were making, so Meredith could get back to work in peace. I did not interrupt him. I let him talk until he ran out of breath. Then, I explained the reality of the situation. I told him I was currently holding 3 separate term sheets, the smallest of which valued my company at 8 figures. I explained that his oldest daughter had not made a simple mistake. She had committed documented corporate espionage and breached a fundamental ethics clause at a publicly traded company. For the first time in my entire life, I heard the absolute silence of fear underneath my father's voice. The booming authority evaporated. He breathed heavily into the receiver. He could no longer brush this off as petty sibling rivalry, because money and reputation had now permanently attached themselves to the insult. The reality of millions of dollars had stripped away his ability to patronize me. I told him not to call me again to negotiate on her behalf, and I ended the call. The final confirmation of my power arrived the next afternoon. Miles walked into my kitchen, skipped his usual greeting, and slid his smartphone across the island toward me. The screen displayed a direct, encrypted message from a senior vice president at Northridge Home. Realizing they could not beat my patent defense, and knowing their own employee had hopelessly compromised them, Northridge had decided to change tactics. They attempted to amputate my operational right arm. The message was a back-channel offer directed entirely at Miles. They were offering him a senior product executive role, a base salary of $500,000, and a massive signing bonus. There was only one condition attached to the golden parachute. He had to immediately walk away from my company and sign a highly restrictive, confidentiality-heavy non-disclosure agreement that would permanently silence him regarding the origins of my hardware. They were trying to buy my lead consultant to cripple my launch. Miles stood leaning against the counter, his arms crossed, watching me read the message. He did not hide it from me. He did not use it as leverage to demand more equity. He simply showed it to me as a piece of tactical intelligence. I pushed the phone back across the counter. I looked up at him, finally understanding the true scale of what I had built in this tiny rented townhouse. Large, predatory companies do not try to poach your right-hand man and bury him under legal paperwork unless they believe you are about to matter. They do not spend $500,000 to stop a nuisance. They only spend that kind of money to stop a genuine threat. "Did you reply?" I asked, my voice steady. "I told them my consulting rates had just gone up," Miles said, the ghost of a hard smile appearing on his face. "And that I only accept equity." I nodded, feeling the last remaining shreds of my old passive self burn away. The market was bleeding, the predators were circling, and my family's toxic hierarchy had completely collapsed under the weight of empirical proof. We are done waiting, I told Miles, grabbing a fresh legal pad from the drawer. We are done chasing validation, and we are done letting these companies set the pace of the negotiations. We need to force the market into a hard deadline. I instructed him to call my attorney and accelerate the due diligence phase across all three offers. I wanted the financial disclosures opened, the patent portfolios verified, and the risk assessments finalized immediately. We were going to pit Ashmere Mutual, Varello Living Systems, and Hearthloop Systems directly against each other in a closed arena. I was no longer interested in a slow, polite dance. I told Miles to give them exactly 14 days to submit their final, binding terms. The strongest buyer was going to have to move right now, with maximum aggression and maximum capital, or they were going to lose the entire category forever. I agreed to exactly one dinner. I did not say yes out of a lingering sense of familial obligation, and I certainly did not agree because I was searching for reconciliation. I agreed because a cold, forensic part of my brain wanted to see what happened to their hierarchy now that the power dynamic had violently flipped. I wanted to sit across from them in a quiet, upscale restaurant and watch who my family became when their casual mockery finally acquired a multi-million-dollar price tag. The reservation was for 7 o'clock on a Wednesday evening at a dim, absurdly expensive French bistro downtown. It was the kind of place where the waiters spoke in hushed tones and the heavy linen tablecloths absorbed all ambient noise. It was the exact opposite of my crowded, chaotic townhouse. I arrived 15 minutes early, ordered a glass of sparkling water, and waited. My parents walked in first, looking deeply uncomfortable in the elegant setting. My father wore a stiff suit he usually reserved for weddings, and my mother was nervously clutching her leather purse. But it was Meredith who drew my attention when she arrived a moment later. She looked polished, wearing a designer silk blouse and her signature immaculate makeup, but the foundation of that polish was fundamentally cracked. Her posture was completely rigid. She carried the brittle, terrifying composure of someone who is using every ounce of their physical energy to keep their life from splitting apart in public. Her eyes were bloodshot, and the skin around her mouth was tight with exhaustion. We ordered our food in a suffocating silence. Nobody mentioned Northridge. Nobody mentioned the patents or the massive bidding war currently raging behind closed corporate doors. We pretended to care about the roasted duck and the seasonal vegetables. Finally, halfway through the main course, my mother could not stand the tension anymore. She reached across the table, her rings clinking softly against her wine glass, and attempted to weave her usual emotional spell. She spoke in soft, rhythmic language about the importance of healing. She used words like forgiveness and moving forward and remembering who we are. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, hoping to activate the decades of conditioning that usually forced me to fold. My father quickly backed her up, clearing his throat and shifting into his booming, authoritative register. He talked about loyalty. He insisted that family matters must remain private, that airing dirty laundry and legal depositions was beneath us. I listened to them carefully, dissecting every sentence. They were not apologizing. They were negotiating. Every soft plea for healing, every stern lecture about privacy, was really just a desperate request for me to absorb the damage one more time so everyone else could go back to being comfortable. They wanted me to drop my defense, let Northridge off the hook, and save Meredith's career. Also, we could pretend that dinner at my house had never happened. I set my fork down. The soft clink sounded like a gunshot in the quiet booth. Before I could dissect my father's hypocritical speech, Meredith finally snapped, the brittle facade shattered. "Do you truly want me to lose my job?" she asked. Her voice was harsh, stripped of all its usual corporate superiority. The entire room seemed to freeze. The waiters walking past our table blurred into the background. It was the first honest sentence anyone had spoken all night. I looked directly into her bloodshot eyes. I did not feel a surge of vindictive joy, nor did I feel the familiar urge to comfort her. I just felt a devastating, oceanic calm. "You are asking the wrong question," I replied, my voice steady and quiet enough that she had to lean in to hear me. "You are asking me to save you from the consequences of your own actions." But you never stop to ask yourself whether mocking my invention in front of the entire family and then broadcasting it to your executives might help kill the only thing I had spent 2 years of my life building. You never cared if I lost my investment. You only care now because the fire you started is burning your own house down. Meredith stared at me, her mouth slightly open. For a long moment, she tried to summon her old arrogance. She tried to roll her eyes or offer a dismissive sigh, but the weight of the truth was simply too heavy. She broke. Tears spilled over her lower lashes, ruining her perfect makeup. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, taking a shuddering breath. "I shared the clip because I thought it would be funny," she admitted, the words tumbling out of her in a pathetic, broken rush. "I thought my team would get a laugh out of it. I did not think they would steal it. I swear to you, I did not think they would actually take it seriously." She lowered her hands, looking at me with a raw, ugly vulnerability. "And maybe on some level, I did it because you were supposed to be the quiet one. You were supposed to stay in your lane. I was the success story. You were supposed to remain the less impressive sister forever. That was the deal. That was how this family worked." There it was, the ugly, beating heart of our entire family dynamic, laid bare on a white tablecloth next to a half-eaten plate of roasted duck. She had not just betrayed me for corporate favor, she had betrayed me to enforce the boundaries of my own mediocrity. My mother let out a small, horrified gasp, finally understanding the depth of the rot. My father, unable to handle the emotional collapse of his golden child, attempted one last, desperate hierarchy play. He slammed his hand flat against the table, rattling the silverware. "Enough," he snapped, glaring at me. "You have won. You have your money coming. You have your patents, and you have proven your point. But you are still her sister. Success is supposed to make you gracious. It is supposed to make you magnanimous. You are gloating, and it is cruel." I turned my gaze to him, feeling the last remaining thread connecting me to this man cleanly sever. "That is the oldest trick in the book," I told him, my voice completely devoid of warmth. "Grace is always demanded from the wounded person. It is never demanded from the one who did the wounding. You watched her humiliate me in my own home, and you laughed. You did not demand grace from her then. You only demand it from me now because I am holding the knife. I am not gloating. I am just refusing to bleed for you anymore." Right as the tension reached its absolute peak, the waiter approached the table, oblivious to the psychological slaughter that had just occurred. He silently distributed 4 leather-bound dessert menus. As a menu was placed in front of me, my phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from my lead patent attorney. The message was brief. Hearthloop Systems had surrendered. They had bypassed the final round of negotiations and sent over a binding term sheet that met every single one of our accelerated demands. The upfront cash number, the founder retention compensation, and the back-end performance upside were locked in. It was a deal strong enough to fundamentally change the trajectory of my entire life. The bidding war was over. I had won. I looked up from the screen. My family was staring at me, waiting for my response to my father's lecture, waiting for me to break the silence, waiting for me to fix the shattered pieces of our evening. I realized, with a profound sense of freedom, that I did not owe them an ending. If I stayed for dessert, they would eventually find a way to recast themselves as my supporters. They would slowly pivot from begging for mercy to celebrating my impending wealth, pretending they had been on my side all along. I refused to give them that opportunity. I placed a $100 bill on top of my unopened dessert menu to cover my portion of the meal. I picked up my purse, stood up from the booth, and walked out of the restaurant without saying another word, leaving them sitting in the quiet wreckage of the truth. The final signature required a simple black pen. After months of grueling, suffocating pressure, the actual conclusion felt almost anticlimactic in its physical execution. I sat in a glass-walled conference room on the 50th floor of the Hearthloop Systems headquarters, surrounded by a small army of corporate attorneys. I carefully signed my name on the final page of the master acquisition agreement, The terms were staggering. I secured a multi-million-dollar upfront cash payment, a highly lucrative founder retention compensation package that guaranteed my operational control for the next 5 years, and a performance upside clause that could theoretically double the total payout over time. My signature transferred the patents, the Brick Harbor pilot data, and the sheer momentum of my hardware to the largest multifamily property technology conglomerate in the country. The acquisition announcement hit the financial wires exactly at 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning. Hearthloop did not bury the news in a standard, dry corporate digest. They blasted it across every major real estate and technology outlet with a headline that was brutal in its elegance. It read, "A once-overlooked retrofit safety device is now the centerpiece of Hearthloop Systems' national multifamily risk strategy." The industry reaction was instantaneous. By 9 o'clock, the article was trending across every professional networking platform. Property managers, insurance underwriters, and rival tech executives immediately began connecting the dots. In the incestuous, fast-paced world of corporate hardware development, secrets do not stay hidden for long. Whispers about Northridge Home attempting to bully a solo founder out of her patents had been circulating for weeks. Now that Hearthloop had loudly and aggressively planted their flag, validating the technology with a massive check, Northridge's attempt to pressure or preempt me no longer looked like a ruthless strategic maneuver. It looked foolish. They had tried to steal a winning lottery ticket and ended up looking incredibly incompetent on a national stage. The fallout from that public humiliation was swift and merciless. At 10:15 that same morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Miles. He had just received an update from his internal compliance contact at Northridge. The ethics review had officially concluded. The legal department had determined that Meredith had recklessly mishandled internal communications, breached confidentiality protocols, and exposed the entire corporation to catastrophic reputational and legal fallout. They did not give her the option to resign quietly or negotiate a graceful exit. They terminated her employment immediately. Security escorted her out of the glass building she had worshipped for a decade, forcing her to carry a cardboard box of her personal belongings past the very colleagues she had originally tried to impress with her stolen video. Her pristine, untouchable corporate identity was completely eradicated before lunch. By noon, a different kind of fallout reached my personal phone. My screen lit up with a relentless, vibrating stream of notifications. The news of the multi-million-dollar buyout had breached the walls of my extended family. The very same aunts, uncles, and cousins who had sat around my dining room table and laughed until they cried at the concept of my panic puck were suddenly flooding my inbox with breathless congratulations. Uncle David sent a long, rambling message claiming he had always known I was brilliant and that he had only been playing devil's advocate that night to test my resolve. Aunt Susan left a cloying voicemail talking about how proud the whole family was of my little project, entirely ignoring the fact that she had wiped away tears of laughter at my expense. The speed and sheer audacity of this historical revision disgusted me far more than it flattered me. They were desperately trying to rewrite their own cruelty, scrambling to secure their proximity to my new, incredibly public wealth. I did not reply to a single one of them. I just watched the messages pile up, feeling a cold, heavy knot of revulsion settle in my stomach. Then, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a text arrived from my mother. It was a group message that included my father. It did not contain any congratulations. It did not contain a single word of apology. It simply read, "We need to speak as a family right now." I stared at the glowing letters on the screen. I instantly understood exactly what that phrase meant. It was code. It was pure, unadulterated panic dressed up as blood loyalty. They had seen the headline. They had seen the estimated purchase price floating around the financial blogs. And most importantly, they had just received the phone call from their golden child, sobbing uncontrollably because her career had evaporated into thin air. The abstract concept of my success had just slammed into their reality like a freight train, and they had absolutely no control over the narrative anymore. I did not type a response. I placed the phone gently on the kitchen island. right on the exact spot where the prototype had sat under a dish towel during that fateful dinner. 10 minutes later, the pounding started. It was not a polite, rhythmic knock. It was frantic, heavy, and desperate. The sheer force of it rattled the hinges of my solid oak front door. I walked quietly from the kitchen into the narrow entryway and peered through the small glass pane beside the door frame. They were all there, standing on my tiny concrete porch, completely devoid of the arrogant composure they had worn at the upscale French bistro just weeks prior. They had driven straight to my house without warning, driven by the explosive reality of the buyout number being made public. My mother was weeping openly, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with loud, theatrical sobs. My father stood slightly in front of her. His face flushed a deep, angry red, his fist raised to pound on the wood again. He looked furious, entirely incapable of processing the fact that the daughter he had always marginalized now held all the cards. And then there was Meredith. She stood behind them, completely unraveling. Her designer trench coat was wrinkled, her hair was a mess, and her mascara was smeared darkly beneath her eyes. She looked small, terrified, and utterly broken. The corporate shield was gone. The sisterly superiority was gone. She was just a woman who had gambled with someone else's life and lost absolutely everything in the process. They were screaming my name through the thick wood. The sound of their voices bleeding through the door felt surreal. They sounded like strangers demanding entry to a club they had just finished burning down. I stood in the hallway, completely still. I did not rush to turn the deadbolt. I did not panic at the sight of my mother's tears or my father's rage. I felt an incredible, anchoring sense of gravity holding me in place. I had imagined this exact reversal of power too many times during those long, lonely nights of soldering wires and rewriting code. I had fantasized about the moment my family would finally be forced to reckon with the reality of what I had built. Now that the moment had arrived, I refused to rush it. I took a deep, slow breath, savoring the absolute silence on my side of the door. I let their panic wash over the exterior of my home, a chaotic storm raging against a fortress they could no longer penetrate. I walked to the door slowly, deliberately, knowing that when I finally chose to engage, the rules of engagement would belong entirely to me. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the solid oak inner door open, but I did not touch the heavy metal mesh screen door. I left it securely locked. I stood in my entryway, looking out at my family through a rigid grid of black steel. It was a perfectly physical barrier, visually articulating everything this family had spent decades refusing to understand about boundaries. My father stepped forward the second the inner door swung open. He pushed his face close to the mesh, his jaw tight. "Annabelle, open this screen right now," he demanded. He dropped his voice into his deepest, most authoritative register, the one he used to command boardrooms and silence arguments at the dinner table. "We need to come inside and figure this out together. And let me be clear right now, this is not about the money." It was a sentence delivered with such aggressive, defensive conviction that I almost smiled. It told me, with almost comic precision, that this was 100% about the money. It was about the 8-figure headline they had all read on their smartphones that morning. It was about their social reputation within our extended family network. And most urgently, it was about the catastrophic, highly public collapse of Meredith's professional life. Before my father could launch into a lecture about loyalty, Meredith shoved her way in front of him. She pressed her hands flat against the cold steel mesh. Her manicured nails were chipped. Her breathing was jagged and uneven. "Annie, please," she begged. Her voice was thin, ragged, and completely stripped of its usual corporate superiority. "You have to help me. You have to call Northridge tomorrow morning. You have to put out a public statement on your new company letterhead. Just tell them the video clip was a family joke taken out of context. Tell them I had your permission to show it to my team as a funny gag. If you do not give me that cover story, they are going to deny my severance package entirely. They are going to blackball me. I will not be able to get a reference anywhere in this industry ever again. My life is ruined." She was shaking. She was looking at me not as a sister, but as a public relations lifeline, fully expecting me to throw myself on the grenade she had carelessly unpinned. A joke taken out of context, I repeated slowly, letting the hollow words hang in the cool afternoon air between us. Is that the narrative we are going with today? Yes, she pleaded, tears cutting tracks through the smeared foundation on her cheeks. Just say it was a misunderstanding. Please, you got your buyout. You won. You are rich now. You do not need to ruin me to prove a point. I absolutely refuse to let you rewrite history, I said, my voice dropping to a register so cold, so terrifyingly calm, that they all stopped moving. I am not issuing a fabricated statement to save your severance package, but if you want to stand on my front porch and talk about that night, we are going to do it with the absolute truth. Say the words, Meredith blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. What? Say the exact words you used at that dinner table, I commanded. Repeat them out loud, right now, to my face. Or I close this door and never speak to you again. She looked back at our parents, panic flashing in her eyes, then looked back at me. Her jaw trembled. She swallowed hard, the humiliation visibly choking her as she realized I held absolute leverage. I called it a burnt toast babysitter, she whispered, stumbling over the syllables. Louder, I said, entirely unmoved by her distress. Say the rest of it. A burnt toast babysitter, she repeated, her voice cracking loudly. I said nobody would ever buy it. I said it was a panic puck for incompetent people. She squeezed her eyes shut, the tears flowing freely now, destroying the last remnants of her polish. I told you to stick to your cute little side project life. I told you to stay in your place. As the final word left her mouth, my mother let out a loud, piercing wail. She collapsed against my father's shoulder, crying harder than I had ever seen her cry in my entire 34 years of existence. She wept loudly, dramatically, her shoulders heaving. She expected the sheer volume of her maternal sorrow to break my resolve, to force me into my old role of the peacemaker, but I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I no longer mistook her tears for moral authority. I looked at her shaking shoulders and saw exactly what it was: sheer, unfiltered panic. She was crying because the old family order had definitively failed. The hierarchy she had carefully curated, the one where Meredith was the shining star and I was the quiet, submissive underachiever, had just been obliterated in front of the entire world, and she had no idea how to survive in a dynamic where I held the power. This was the precise moment where the old Annabelle would have caved. I would have unlocked the screen door, invited them inside, brewed a pot of expensive tea, and spent the rest of the evening drafting a legal fiction to save my sister's reputation. I would have let them drag me back into the fold, accepting their toxic, conditional love in exchange for my own dignity. Listen to me very carefully, I told them, locking eyes with Meredith until she was forced to look back at me. I am not going to destroy you further. I am not going to leak the private digital forensics of you uploading that file to your executives. I am not going to drag this family through a vindictive public lawsuit just to humiliate you in the press. You have already lost your job and your standing, and I have absolutely no interest in twisting the knife for sport. Meredith let out a ragged, desperate breath, a tiny glimmer of hope sparking in her swollen red eyes. But, I continued, crushing that hope instantly and completely, I am also not going to rescue you. I am not signing a public statement. I am not calling your compliance department. I am not extending my hand to pull you out of a corporate fire you started entirely by yourself. You are going to have to find a new job, in a new industry, with no references, entirely on your own merits. I will not save people who only discovered respect for me after a multi-million-dollar buyout number forced it into them. My father opened his mouth to argue, his face turning purple with indignation, but I raised my hand, silencing him with a sharp, dismissive gesture. I am giving you one single condition for any future relationship with me, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. There will be no more revisionist nonsense. Do not ever tell your friends you believed in me from the start. Do not ever spin a family myth where your cruelty was actually just tough love and concern. If you ever want access to my life again, it must begin with the absolute truth. You mocked me. You tried to steal from me, and you failed. That is the only reality I will accept. Nobody spoke. The silence on the porch was absolute, heavier than any argument we had ever had in my entire life. They stared at me through the steel mesh, finally realizing that the woman they had driven across town to manipulate simply did not exist anymore. I stepped back into the shadows of my hallway. I gripped the heavy brass handle of the solid oak door, and without another word, I pushed it shut in their faces. The heavy latch clicked into place with a deep, satisfying thud, severing the sight of them entirely. I turned the deadbolt, sliding the thick metal rod securely into the doorframe. I stood in the quiet hallway for a long moment, listening. There was no more pounding. There were no more demands. After a few minutes, I heard the heavy, shuffling footsteps retreating down the concrete steps, followed by the distant sound of a car engine starting and pulling away from the curb. I walked out of the entryway and stepped into my kitchen. The late afternoon light was streaming through the windows, catching the dust motes dancing softly in the air. The house was perfectly still, perfectly quiet, and completely mine. I walked over to the kitchen island and stopped. I looked at the exact spot on the granite counter where the very first prototype had once sat, hidden beneath that embarrassing checkered dish towel. I traced my fingers over the cool, empty stone. For 2 long years, I had thought the ultimate victory would be the money. I thought seeing those millions of dollars hit my bank account would finally silence the ghosts of their laughter and prove my worth. But as I stood alone in the quiet peace of my own home, holding the keys to my own future, I realized the profound truth. The money was just a byproduct. The real revenge was never the financial valuation alone. It was becoming the person who finally gets to decide which door stays shut. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Where are you listening from? Please drop a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.